load the Psy Cannons and power up the Force weapons, because today we're talking Grey Knights units and how strong they are. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel, where today we're taking a second look at the Grey Knight Codex, talking about each and every datasheet, and where I think they stack up in relation to each other. Of course, these tier lists are always just a little bit arbitrary. Different units will work well in different playstyles, and the Codex only has been released a little while ago, and it's perfectly possible that I might have underestimated or overestimated some units. If you disagree with any of the rankings, please let me know down in the comments below. You might educate me and everyone else. In any case though, let's jump straight into it. I've organised their choices into 3 different tiers, and we'll start with tier 3 the lowest, and work our way towards the top tier things. So in tier 3 of the Grey Knights Codex, I've ranked Land Raiders and the Grey Knights Flyers. For Land Raiders, I'm afraid the small points decrease doesn't really help all that much. They still don't really have all that much synergy with the rest of the Grey Knight Codex, and I think that other transport options remain the better way of delivering Grey Knight units. I think Land Raiders are going to remain in a very strange spot while they can still be locked up and have all their firepower have to be directed against a unit of chaff that's touching them in combat, which is quite likely to happen if they are trundling towards the enemy, trying to deliver their transport contents into battle. Their firepower and durability are both okay, though not enormously standout I'd say, particularly in the face of 9th edition anti-tank weapons. I think there's better choices. Otherwise, I've chosen to rank the Storm Raven, Storm Talon and Stormhawk Interceptor here. Fairly well copy-pasted datasheets from Codex Space Marines, and none of these really seem to see all that much play in the standard Codex Space Marines, when they arguably have better advantages, including combat doctrines and their choice of chapter tactics or synergy with armies like Iron Hands. For shooting, they're just not particularly better than core Dread Knights, and they can receive buffs, do psychic, have better defense, and are better in melee. The only thing that's really going for these planes is the mobility. I guess perhaps someone might have a go at making a Sword Bearer's Flyer Wing work. They can get +1 to hit and +1 to wound for all Grey Knight vehicles, and maybe that might be enough to have the plane's Alpha Strike enemy units off the board. Again though, it just seems like that might be a better strategy to use with Dread Knights, as opposed to relying on some fairly flimsy and fairly expensive flyers. Moving up to tier 2 now, and this is where I've chosen to rank the units that I think are all usable, but maybe just not quite as standout or outright impressive as the ones that I've ranked in tier 1. First up, I've chosen the Purgation Squad to be placed here. They feel like they're a unit that might just be on the cusp of working with all of their psi weapon benefits. They are perhaps the best way just to spam psi weapons and nothing else, and there are quite a lot of buffs in the Grey Knight Codex that can get a bit more out of their psi cannons and silencers. I feel like their stratagems to buff the psi weapons though are just a bit on the pricey side, with not amazing command point return for the buffs that you get, and the fact that they're all heavy weapons as well means that they're going to be hitting a fair bit less accurately. Again, not comparing amazingly well with Dread Knights with Gatling silencers and heavy psi cannons. Maybe we might see some cheap squads popping out of Deep Strike with incinerators or something. That does seem like a reasonable enough way to pop down quite a lot of heavy flamer firepower out of the blue. Next up, I've chosen to rank Grey Knight Terminators here, who I feel really haven't been done all that many favours in the transition to the new decks. They do seem a little bit stronger than they were before, admittedly, with an extra wound, but just comparing them like for like with the Strike Squad, and their numbers just really don't stack up all that well. Strike Marines are only just over half the price, meaning that you do get near enough double the shooting and melee per model, and the durability is pretty close as well, depending on whether or not it's easier to slog through 1 Terminator model or 2 standard Space Marine models. Just in general, I do find it quite hard to justify the Terminators over those numbers. It's not to say that they don't have some advantages though. You can make some really big squads for concentrated buffs. Their firepower is a bit more flexible, having basically the same shooting if you're moving and firing at 24 inches, and they do have their stratagem for +1 to hit in melee, which is handy. For troops though, I do feel that people are likely to be playing Strike Marines more than Terminators. Sticking with the Terminator theme now, and next we have the Paladins, the Elite's Choice Extra Fighty Grey Knight Terminators. They pay an extra 5 points over the standard ones, and for that they get a 2+ weapon skill and an extra attack. It's quite nice they have a little bit of extra flexibility with the Sanctit discipline as well. Rather than just being locked to Hammerhand, they can take the other options too. Again, like the Terminators, their damage output just isn't really significantly better than the Strike Squads, particularly in melee. Even with the boosted numbers, they're likely to land less attacks than their equivalent points cost in Strike Marines. Still though, again like the Terminators, they do allow you to concentrate loads of force in just one unit. I guess if you can put together all of the durability and offensive buffs together in one unit in the Grey Knights Codex, Paladins might not be the worst choice for that. Just kind of a shame that there's not really any additional durability for them, unless you go casting things like Armoured Resilience each turn, which the standard Terminators don't have access to. Moving on, I've also chosen to rank the Razorback here as a potentially interesting vehicle transport option for Grey Knights. In reality, I'm not sure how much play it's actually going to see, but I feel like transports of some variety will certainly help out the Knights. Units like Strike Squads and Purifiers have got excellent stat lines but need to get up close, and if you're not just going for the bog standard Rhino, I guess the Razorback could be an interesting alternative if you did want a few guns on the top. Maybe not the worst transport if you only need to transport 5 Marines into the fray, and again could be made more interesting by the Sword Bearers Brotherhood. Dreadnoughts and Venerable Dreadnoughts I'd also put in the bracket of being okay though not enormously standout. They're basically quite similar to their standard Codex Space Marine datasheet equivalents, except they pay an extra 10 points to be a Psyker. I'm not necessarily sure that being a Psyker is a massive advantage in the Grey Knights Codex, you're already likely to be throwing enough smite around, but I guess casting armor resilience each turn isn't too bad. It's basically giving it just a slightly unreliable 2+ armor save. I'll be most inclined to run them in the Las Cannon missile launcher loadout to provide some dedicated long-range anti-tank if you wanted it, though again I do feel for the Dreadnoughts that just the mere fact of Dread Knights existing really doesn't help them get noticed. Finally, I've chosen to rank all the characters here that I think are just solidly usable for the Grey Knights, though maybe not enormously stand out in their own right. Here I've placed the Captain, Grandmaster, Champion, Librarian, Captain Stern, Grandmaster Voldus, Apothecary, Ancient, Tech Marine and Crow. The vast majority, I'd argue, do seem to have at least some use case, whether you might want to invest in a captain to give them that psychic locus stratagem, or mix psychic powers with the benefits of apothecaries, ancients, or tech marines. I think it just depends on what sort of list they're supporting. It is quite nice that all the characters also act as a Dominus Discipline Psyker as well, which means they're all going to be doing at least something useful in addition to their other abilities. I think maybe particularly of note are Librarians, who give you the most efficient Dominus powers per point, and can build that slightly silly Mortal Wounds bomb unit, the one that can theoretically drop around 11 mortal wounds in a turn with a Warlord trait and stratagem, provided none of his powers are denied. Generally though, aside from some really standout pieces that we'll get onto, I think most of the Grey Knight character section is quite well balanced, fairly usable without invalidating the other options. Finally though, we're getting onto the really good stuff, and at the moment I think that these are the units that people are most likely to be building around in their Grey Knight armies. First up we have none other than the humble Rhino, cheap, cheerful and effective, and seeing as Strike Marines don't have the most reliable ways of getting into combat, it seems like quite an efficient pickup to help deliver them into combat a bit easier. Not really masses more to say about that one. A nice armoured hull to protect them as they move up the board, then can be used as a battlefield bunker to charge out of. I do quite like the way that it can transport interceptors as well. Their teleporter packs don't count as jump infantry, unlike quite a lot of other similar units in other codexes, so interesting to be able to deploy some fast movers from there if you need to. Next up we do have the Strike Squad themselves, 22 points of just raw incredibly efficient stats. Their shooting solid enough with their Stormbolters, their melee is truly great with 3 strength 5 AP-3 attacks with 2 damage each turn, and can double down on that with Hammerhand or just Smite if that makes more sense. On top of that, their defense isn't really all that bad either. They're only a couple of points more expensive than Space Marine Intercessors, and although I'd argue that these guys have less support than the Intercessors and Space Marine units do within their codex, their raw stat line does put a lot of other similar units to shame. Why wouldn't you want a Marine that's only a couple of points more than an Intercessor, with a similar level of shooting, combat stats of a Blade Guard veteran, and is also a Psyker that can deep strike for free? These guys really do seem fairly undercosted, though I think that delivering them to do all that damage is maybe the main challenge. As one alternative to Strike Marines we have the Purifiers. These guys are the Elite's Choice variant, the main difference being that they trade Hammerhand for their 3 damage Smite equivalent of Cleansing Flame. That's really quite a powerful punch on top of what Strike Marines can normally do, and they do also have one very helpful stratagem as well that can give them -1 damage for increased survivability against damage 2 weapons. That could definitely be worth a couple of command points if you are targeted by the right guns. Third and finally, for our very scary Strike Squad variants, we have the Interceptors, the fast attack choice for 24 points per model, and are just basically a Strike Squad that trade their Obsec and Hammerhand for raw speed moving 12 inches, and a few teleport shenanigans such as falling back and shooting, or their move shoot move psychic power. For just an extra 2 points over the Strike Marines, I think these guys really are a steal. Their combat damage is still great even without Hammerhand, and as I mentioned, I think the main weakness of Strike Marines is delivering them into combat. These guys are going to get there very easily indeed. It seems that most competitive lists are running 3 chunky units of these at the moment. I think they're perhaps one of the nearest auto-includes in a Grey Knight army. Moving on, we come to the Nemesis Dread Knight itself, which being their only unique vehicle, is kind of nice that it's pretty efficient. The Dread Knights are basically just all-round threatening right now, perhaps the default being the Great Sword plus Heavy Side Cannon and Gatling Silencer, 175 points, gives you 18 quality shooting shots, really powerful melee backed up by Hammer Hand if you need it, and quite solid defense as well, with 13 wounds and a 2+ armor save with a 4+ invul. As if that's not all, they do get the core unit keyword as well, meaning that they can receive buffs like reroll 1s to hit from Grandmaster Dread Knights perhaps, and again like the other vehicles they have good use in sword bearers, with Dread Knight shooting potentially being a very scary threat indeed, with +1 to hit and wounds. Definitely another really solid unit that you can build a list around. Spamming these might not be the worst choice in the world. Perhaps Dread Knights might not be used in every single competitive list, though I think that one Grandmaster Dread Knight is almost certain to make an appearance. He basically does everything that a standard Dread Knight does, except costing a bit more for hitting on 2s and having his reroll 1s buffing aura. Bringing an extra dominance power to the fray isn't a bad thing either. What really takes these Grandmaster Dread Knights to the next level though are their warlord traits, relics and wisdoms of the prognosticars. Perhaps the single silliest one is the Sigil of Exigence. That's the one that allows you to teleport away whenever your Grandmaster is shot, so potentially deny the enemy an entire turn of shooting at him. And even when that's been used up, he can have another turn with the Servant of the Throne, Wisdom of the Prognosticars, and that will give him a 3+ invul save for an entire turn as well. He can also take up to 2 warlord traits if he wants to as well, including having obsec, or buffs to either making charges into combat, or +1 to wound when he is there. This guy seems near enough guaranteed to be an enormous annoyance to the enemy army, and one that they're going to struggle to deal with. Next up, and sticking with the HQ section, we have Caldor Drago himself, the Supreme Grandmaster of the Grey Knights. I think for points invested in HQs, he is perhaps one of the best. Sure, he's a little bit more pricey than some at 180 points, but he really does everything well. 8 wounds with a 2+ armor and 3+ invul save is going to be really sturdy to get through. He's enormously fighty in combat with his Titan Sword, and for buffs he can cast 2 Dominus powers and give 1 unit full unrestricted rerolls to hit. He's really quite easy to field as well as an HQ choice, as he gets around the Grandmaster limitation, so you could potentially have both him and a Grandmaster Dread Knight both in the same detachment, if you want to max out on valuable HQ choices. Finally, the last of the really standout HQs is the Brotherhood Chaplain, who I think perhaps just punches above his weight, purely because of his Words of Power listening. He still casts a Dominus power like the rest, but Words of Power is the one that gives you exploding 6s to wound in combat, and also if you happen to be in the Tide of Convergence, it means that you'll get an extra mortal wound on 6s to wound as well. Combine that with Grey Knight strike squads in using Hammer Hands to reroll the wound roll, and you're almost guaranteed to have a whole ton of 6s. He might well be able to drown the enemy under the sheer amount of mortal wounds, never mind their amazing high damage, high strength attacks. It's such a powerful melee buff that in the right circumstances, I think you could certainly justify the 2 command points to auto pass it, and still near guarantee the death of anything that a strike squad with Hammer Hand is charging. He does appear to be popping up in quite a lot of Grey Knight lists, and it's not too hard to see why he will make a squad a turn win the melee game. Finally, last and arguably least, I'd like to rank Servitors in Tier 1 as well, just because of the pure utility that these little guys get for a Grey Knight list. It does feel weird ranking essentially a slightly useless unit in Tier 1, but 9th edition isn't just all about the killing, it's also about actions, objectives and things, and even just having junk units to screen out deep strikes, or just screen charges and things, has a value all of its own, and it's doubly valuable in Grey Knights when they don't have any other infantry units that are less than 100 points. These guys can screen charges, screen deep strike, block movement, do actions, and do backfield objective camping if they're out of line of sight, just as well as a lot of Grey Knight units, and it could potentially save you quite a lot of points sitting on backfield objectives that could be moving up the board and threatening your opponents. I genuinely think that the majority of Grey Knight competitive lists will take at least 1 unit of these guys along. Small expendable units have a value all of their own in 9th edition, and these guys are particularly valuable in Grey Knights who really don't have all that many to access. So I think that just about brings us to the end of our review of Grey Knight units. Let me know what you think of the rankings down in the comments below, and particularly if you think I've ranked anything either too high or too low. It'd be good to hear your feedback. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k content coming, hopefully with a fair bit more for the Grey Knights. Finally, if you'd like to help support the channel, I would just like to mention one way in which you can do so, which is the Auspex Tactics Patreon page down in the video description. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, including seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, then the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.